countries, cooperative banks, producer cooperatives, and they are the basis of actually extending credit to farming communities. But let me raise this in the specific context of Kenya. I know you represent the Mandera, district. But imagine a situation where communities collateralize their land, and there is a default on loan, either to institutions and so on and so forth, and they lose this, and you project this for 25 years ahead. What are the likely implications of a situation where you actually end up in massive land dispossessions, okay, in which land ownership now gets concentrated in the hands of, What are the implications for communities where lineage ownership, rather than just individual ownership, and the fact that you cannot alienate land? Specifically, what does this say for Kenyan politics if you were to look at the history of land dispossession in the Kikuyu areas, for instance? Now, what I'm saying here is this. The need for us to actually to be imaginative, and rather than just regurgitate, what people say from outside, and development strategies that speak to our own context and our own people. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Sakini Michael from Sierra Leone. My question goes to the presenters. What will be the role of civil society in the implementation of all recommendations that have been proffered here? This goes for others.
Shall we take the last one for this? Yes, please.
This one? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair and Moderator. My question goes to two of the panelists. The first one to Honorable Senator Bill Okero, my fellow Kenyan. In Kenya, we have the peculiarity, perhaps it's in other African countries, maybe it's more pronounced in Kenya, about what you can call the straddling classes. That is, the fact that in Kenya, often the owners of capital are also the governors and are also part of the labor aristocracy. How do you resolve contradictions related to division of benefits, which has also caused a lot of inequalities between these classes in that kind of context? Two, one of the presenters also talked in terms of who has the numbers, controls the narrative. In Kenya, we have a very, again, peculiar narrative called the tyranny of numbers, which I think many of the Kenyans present here will be alive to. It's a narrative which can also be called an ideology of exclusion. How do you address issues such as that, especially when you find that that narrative is actually based on falsehoods rather than actual demographic data? Finally, in terms of institutional design, it has been overemphasized about the weakness of the state, capacity deficiencies, and all sorts of things. But you find that in certain countries, Kenya one of them, the bureaucracy actually is not weak, it's actually strong. And the issues of refusal to change are more important than inability to effect the changes. So in that kind of respect, when you have clawback and resistance from the bureaucracy, how do you address issues which are related to inequality? Thank you.
Okay. Well, so yes, I recall well the question that was directed to me, although the first one also the question of the government power being eroded. How do we make sure that the government is back on that? Well, I think that's why we have been talking about developmental state. it has to play its role, and the other things will follow. And there is much on the agenda of a developmental state. There was the question that, 50 years is a long time and we don't know what will happen. No, I mean, it will be broken into periods and it will be updated every now and then as the future becomes clearer and clearer. It's not going to be cast in stone. It will be a living document that will be updated every now and then to make sure that it is realistic. I think there was the question of how do you finance all this. You will be amazed how much money there is, but has to be harnessed. Now, if we went into details, we would have mentioned. You are aware that President Thabo Mbeki, was assigned to look at the illicit outflows from Africa, and there is an estimate of about 50 to 60 billion that is illicitly flowing out of Africa. If you just stop that, it's more than ODA, actually, that in itself. But also, a lot of governments now, by reforming their tax systems, their administration, and improving the quality of their expenditure, things are changing. A lot is being raised. Every now and then, as the economy grows, tax bases change. So the structure has to change those bases. To make sure that you raise the revenue and administer it properly. And of course, it has to be progressive to take care of the issue of inequality. And a lot is being mobilized. So domestic resource, we can spend the whole day just talking about domestic resource. Practical things that can be done, and others are beginning to do them, and to their surprise, they are mobilizing more resources. It can be done, it's not a dream. And the African Development Bank has a concept of Africa 2050, where they feel that African assets can be leveraged to raise funding even in the international markets to finance this ambitious infrastructure that do not attract either public funding or private sector funding, because they are regional, they are cross-border, and so on. And it's really a package that works because the board has approved it, and a lot of people so far think that it's an idea that can work. So these things can be done. The role of civil society, these are people's documents. Everybody was involved. So they will play the role that they have been playing, that they are playing, except that it will be made easier for them to work for development. So there is a role for civil society. Maybe I'll stop here and give others a chance. Thank you.
So, Prof.
Thank you very much to the questioners. The papers that we have delivered and that other people have delivered in the conference will be available to all of us, and I encourage us to go back and review many of these questions. Specifically on strengthening the capacity of countries to be able to track and analyze trends. That is indeed the mandate of the regional and other organizations, and we take up that challenge to help in this kind of capacity building. On the question of gender budgeting, I think that yesterday Tandika made a point in the morning that sometimes we get very specific. I think that in a lot of the discussions we've been talking about how many of the issues are cross-cutting, and that sometimes you actually are more effective when you don't target. He specifically mentioned the role of wage employment and what it has, equalizing wages and what it does to women's empowerment. And I think we can take this in mind, that it's not an exclusive thing, that yes, we will track the budget to see how much, the incidence of spending, but it is also important to pursue more general measures which may look neutral on the surface, but which can actually succeed in improving the position of women and other groups. On the role of civil society, when we were being asked to, this morning, when we were going around and talking about the takeaways from the sessions yesterday, those of you who were in the session on social policy, I was really struck by the comment from somebody here who said that the citizen is now a project. The citizen has become a project. I think that both in the question of the fragility of states and the question of institutions, we've been talking about the fact that at the same time that we need so many more things, governments are incapable of doing them, that the functions have been eroded. But also that citizens, there is not active citizenship. You know, we think that anything that we're given is a gift from government. So we are not making demands, we do not have social movements that make demands on governments to pursue that. And that, in a way, part of it has come about because of privatization and NGOization. So civil society also has a role in promoting an active citizenship. And the person will say, let's go back to the primary schools and talk about citizenship. Let's go to the women's groups and talk about citizenship. You know, how do we create active citizenships, active citizens who are able to hold governments accountable for what they do? This is the role for civil society and all of us. It's not just for civil society, but for all of us. Yes, the issue of power, data power, and inclusion. I think that you know, manipulation of data. Yesterday, two of the speakers, I think Lebohang and the Statistician General of South Africa, they called for a data revolution. When data is available to everybody, it makes it much more difficult for it to be manipulated by only a few people. We should not think of data as something neutral, etc. But we should really inform ourselves. We're being told to go beyond the averages to really find the picture. So I think that we have been provided with a lot of data and information over these last 3 days to begin to make a change where we are in our own countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me respond to a couple of comments. One on the collateralizing of land. I think there is a saying, and there is an African saying, that one does not refuse to eat for fear of choking. You can't refuse to eat. You can't refuse, really. What we are talking about here is we have land. It's a valuable asset. In the rest of the developed world, land is used as a very important source of capital. So we have a situation in Africa where an individual has 10 acres, 100 acres of land, but cannot access credit, does not have capital to start business, so what happens is that ability really of countries in Africa, individuals in Africa, to go into entrepreneurship, to access, resources so that they can invest and be in business is really significantly affected by that. And I think what we're saying is that even in terms of the nation, when you look at the economy, the GDP of the country is significantly, our GDP, personally I believe the economies in Africa are significantly understated because our land resource, which is massive, is not factored in. We all sit on thousands, millions of acres because you are small scale farmers or you are subsistence or whatever, it's not captured in the economy. But in the rest of the world, really, there is the single most important source of you can use is the land that we have, is the security. We've gone to the rest of the world where people today are using paper. In the case of the US, you all know that when the subprime mortgage thing in 2008, it's not just about even mortgaging of the property. They went into a level where people are mortgaging papers that have been, derivatives that have come out of that. So we have a situation where, in our case, we actually have the tangible asset, and we are not utilizing, and the person is poor, the nation is poor, because all those resources cannot be used. And let me tell you, the economies of the world, it's about the finance we talk about, it's about credit. The money that we are looking for from the partners, that we are talking about, that Marvin is talking about, this is credit by banks. How do banks make credit? Where do they get that ability for you to generate resources, really? is dependent on the asset that you can use. So we have a situation where we have assets and we can't use. And I think if we only look about, if we are not, we have to be positive about these things. If we look at the negative aspect, that you'll be dispossessed of land, only that aspect, I think we'll be missing the point, in my view. And the reason why the question also raised regarding the political, those who have capital, is because of the same reasons. That the challenge really is who can access capital. It's those of us who are elites, who are in town, the politicians, the managers, those are the people who are in town who can access. Because in their case, their land, their titles, everything, they can access credit. But the rest do not. And I think this is why, in my view, it's really important to address, because this is the only way you can access resource and address the imbalance between the levels of society. And so it's significant that collateralization is important. In my view, you don't look at it from the loss of the assets only, but the fact that our economies are grossly understated because we don't have those values, factored in the economy. So it's more important than natural resources, more important than the oil and the other natural resources the land value that we have. And by the way, the land value also is enhanced when it can be used for collateral purposes. If it's not going to be used for collateral, it loses value. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I just want to make a few comments in response to the questions. It's telling me to shut up. Now, when we talk about the need for a paradigm shift and towards a transformative agenda, development agenda, I think inherent in that is really the need to come up with a completely new model that is context-specific. We should not transfer or think that models will be successful if they're transferred from one context to another, if the fit is not right. And so I would say that I don't want to refer specifically to the issue of Kenya. I'm not sufficiently familiar with it. The best approach would be find a model that best suits the context, the national or local context in the country. And that does not mean using what you have. It could mean starting from scratch, to have a discussion about what is that best model, what are the features and makeup of that model. But for that to happen, you have to engage with citizens. And I think the response to the question about civil society, that is really your main channel for engaging with the community and with citizens. Civil society organizations are an important channel or medium for that engagement. Now, the other comment I want to make is that women are also, the whole issue of gender is very, very important. Yes, it is a cross-cutting issue, but it is also a very specific issue for targeting. And I think the earlier response by Professor Tandiwe is also important, is a very relevant one. In the context of the post-2015 discussions that are taking place in New York, what is in fact happening is the recognition of the need to have some sort of specific goal on gender, but to also make it cross-cutting to all of the other goals. And so, it's going to be done, and it will prioritize the role of women in development. And my last comment has to be on the role of the state or the civil service. Again, I think Kenya is very good in terms of having a strong bureaucracy, but I want to suggest that the role of an effective or efficient civil service are really a few things. One is to facilitate that dialogue and the engagement of citizens. That is the role of the civil service, partly. To create an environment in which that dialogue, the engagement of citizens and setting development priorities and identifying and pursuing the implementation of those priorities is very, very crucial. The other role of the civil service, in particular institutions, national institutions, would really be to manage and implement your development plans and objectives. And the third is really to ensure efficient provision of services. And so if that is the sort of role of government as you see it, that needs to be properly defined, and it needs to be done through the engagement of all parties. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there was a specific reference to finances and to Barbara represents ministers of finance here. So I think I'd just like to be very brief and remind all of us that the role of government is very important in the nexus between private and public capital, whether it's through, PPP as we know it now, or exclusively by government is very important. But when it comes to public finances, I think the flip side of government expenditure is government taxation. And oftentimes that also takes from the private sector in particular, it takes from employees. And a liberal tax regime is often something that is also good for the country to the extent that the private sector can also be efficient. I think part of what has also been, and I've not been here throughout the period, but I think we should also spare a thought for SMEs and the emergence of microfinance institutions and others in the country, because even in advanced countries, the engine for growth, the engine for employment, and the engine for many things is actually small and medium enterprises. And therefore, when we talk about big infrastructure development and others, yes, governments have a role to play in this. But when it comes to development, sometimes at a local level, when it comes to even alleviation of poverty, instead of looking to aid, small finances as we know them can go a long way actually in alleviating poverty, entrepreneurship. So I think that is also, one element in which governments will have a role to play, but governments must be efficient. And let me link this quickly to institutions. I think institutions are very important. Markets, has just been debated. And I think there was a time when Hernando de Soto's point about collateralization of property in developing countries was a big hit. And I think that is the point about the point that the senator is making, that we tend to often bury capital in assets and don't bring it up to the market. At this point, you have the tension between, capital markets and what they represent, including the discussions on structural adjustment and what it has done. But it is only when African governments are efficient, also in many respects, including recovery of loans, which we often also take for our state-owned enterprises, which fail to recover, and therefore we depend on the taxpayer for even the maintenance of the facility for which we took the loan. Unless we move and deepen the efficiency of our institutions, I think that we would be going back into the trap of economic recovery, structural adjustments, and all that, which is not to downplay areas or issues such as the volatility of commodity markets. And I think mention was made of value addition, which many countries are doing. We also need to look critically at what some resource-rich countries are doing today, the establishment of sovereign wealth funds that will be used to leverage the markets, and which can be linked to the, I'm aware, the African Development Bank initiative, that was mentioned. So there is a role for public sector, there is a role for private sector, but both of which, unless we want to depend almost exclusively on taxation for development, there's a need to leverage markets. And even when you allocate resources for local governments, as has been mentioned in Kenya, or in Ghana as we do with the District Assembly's Common Fund, the question is, can those resources also be leveraged through municipal bonds and others, again back to securitization and collateralization to leverage the markets. So I think a healthy discussion of the markets and what they represent is also very important in whatever form or shape, because this experience of both, as we now know, a lot of countries. And I think that this is a question which Africa, has to debate in the context of public finances and the context of mobilization of resources by the private sector for the development of the continent.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. I'll seek your indulgence for just half a minute so that the lawyer in me can talk about land. When I lend you $10 against 100 acres of land, when you cannot pay, I'm supposed to sell the land, take off my $10, interest, administrative charges, and give the balance to you. But very often, by the time you get to that position, you've been driven against the wall. But you don't have to have one title for that 100 acres of land. You can demarcate it into 5 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres, and you know that each time you borrow, you use the 5 acres, and you have the rest of the acres, even if you have 10, 20 titles, and I'm charging for that. Honorable Minister, allow me to say thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much for what you have shared with us, and thank you to all distinguished guests for having been such good participants. Honorable Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I believe that we've gone past the period for break and then the breakout sessions, which continues with lunch. I don't know if the moderator is taking over at this point.
I am a fake moderator. The proper moderator is probably on his way to Addis Ababa. Thank you very much, panelists, Honorable Minister, Chair. There were lots of discussions about financing, which I am sure that our good rapporteurs would make available for sharing among all of us, but which also might benefit the Minister. But we really appreciate your spending all of the time as well. We should channel that. Also to remind you that in terms of documentation, please visit the dedicated website. It has most of the information, www.africainequalities.org. So a lot of the presentations will be offloaded there as well. So there is a place for, it's a depository of the information you might want to take a look at. Going forward, it might also be the place to find a lot of these, the panel synthesis and so on. So we have a short break, but probably I would suggest that on your way out for tea and coffee, grab your tea and coffee if it is there, or cocoa, and go straight to the breakout panels. The discussion, the breakout panels are three: economic inclusion and equity in Committee Hall 1, social inclusion, social protection and equity in Committee Hall 2, and political inclusion and equity in Meeting Room 1. The focus of the discussion,
which our moderator asked, I would ask that he continues with the recap and the dialogue that goes into that. Then I'll come in at the end of that before we move into the next session.
Thank you, Minister. Yesterday we had a very robust conversation, very robust in many ways, because it was a build-up from day one, which sought to define two things: what the agenda for structural transformation currently is and has historically been, and where the conversation on inequality is. And also, day one sought to point out convergence and divergence of the two agendas: the agenda for structural transformation and the agenda on fighting inequalities. Yesterday, I think we began the conversation with a framing by Professor Tandika Mkandawire that looked at our thinking around structural transformation and inequality. We ended the day by looking at the questions of political, economic, and spatial inequalities. As we did yesterday, instead of getting one person to be the exemplar of public reason in doing the recap, I would like to elicit only 5 or so comments, incisive views about what emerged, because you did go into parallel sessions, and there were several parallel sessions yesterday. Just the takeaways, the key things that, that came out of the conversation yesterday. The most important thing as we go into day 3 is the following. Having heard what we were privileged to hear over the last 2 days, if we were to zero in on a practical set of actions, what will those actions be? What will those interventions be? And those interventions are at the global level, and our colleagues from the United Nations system will help walk us through the opportunities at that level. At the regional level, we have His Excellency Commissioner for Economic Affairs, Dr. Anthony Maruping, who will also help us do the linkage between the regional and the global and the national, country, local level issues that we grapple with, so that we have a seamless linkage in the interventions we are going to propose out of this conference and some of the critical issues we need to grapple with. I just will take 5 interventions or so, just on what the takeaways from yesterday were for you. Do by show of hands. Those of you who were in the last plenary conversation, you remember that the Statistician General from South Africa and that panel helped us look at the relevance and the place of evidence in our policy making, in our planning, in the interventions we will propose. I have one hand there, 2, 3 at the back. Okay. Please, for the benefit of the panel, kindly introduce yourself and then make your point.
My name is Nancy Alexander from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. It's really a privilege to be here. And one of the things that came out of our session was an awareness that during the many, many years of while it needs of the people spending repatriation or have excessive user fees, and that's partly what we pay taxes for. So it's good to achieve that kind of balance and have infrastructure be for the people and getting goods to markets and reaching those in rural areas, reaching women and so on, to help them find jobs, reach jobs, and so on, rather than engage in really high price tag projects that may be extremely risky. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had one hand up at the back.
Good morning. This is Landon. The most resonant thing that came out for me yesterday was at the political inequality session. We had an activist turned government politician from Nigeria in our group who basically said that as a member of government, her hands are tied and she is part of a system. She illustrated this by saying that she is simply a brick, one brick in a big brick wall, and that the only way to have structural transformation would be, and these are my words, to attack that wall with a sledgehammer. And the only sledgehammer that really would be able to attack that wall are the people, the citizens. And to quote her, although I might be misquoting her a little, she said, as a government politician, there's nothing more she really wanted than to have the people clamoring for change so that she could then instrumentalize it. That was what resonated with me.
Thank you. There was a hand here.
Thank you. My name is Nimoy Thompson. I'm the senior. A number of issues that I picked up from the various forums. One is that we should perhaps pay more attention to the international dimensions of inequality as well. There was the feeling that perhaps we're focusing more on just ourselves and leaving out the international institutions, relations, and how they ultimately translate into inequalities in our respective countries. And the international dimension obviously has two dimensions itself. One is the private sector, especially foreign direct investment, which has now become a bit of a fetish. But it also has its own downside. The tax breaks that already revenue-stressed countries do give to these companies often have no empirical basis. And if you do take the trouble to do even a back-of-the-envelope analysis, you realize that the net benefit is actually negative. And then the bilateral and also global level, the nature of the relationship between governments and African governments. And there was an observation that the issue of inequality, for instance, was removed from some report, the high-level panel's report, at the last moment, reflecting the influence of certain countries. There's the issue of the ultimate role or significance of local government, in the sense that all development, just like all politics, all development is ultimately local. All development occurs in communities, and that there needs to be a focus on that. And related to that is the importance of administrative statistics, and the South African statistician general did touch a great deal on that. That's actually a big hole in the case of Africa. And then lastly, the need for some sort of an implementation framework, that it's not enough to just have conferences like this and issue communiques and recommendations. But one word that someone used was deja vu, that we've seen this all before. And frankly speaking, there's nothing here that's been said in the past 3 days that's completely new. We've talked about it, and the only difference perhaps is the forum. So what we'll do going on from here that will be different, that next time we happen to meet again to discuss inequalities, we can actually say that there's some progress. When we met in Accra in April 2014, this was the state of inequality in Africa. And now that we're meeting in, I don't know, Abuja or Tanzania or wherever, this is the state of inequality. We need some sort of a framework or mechanism to be able to track that. Thank you.
I had offered 5. I see one at the back.
Ouais, merci à tout le monde. Je vois que dans ces 2 derniers jours de travaux, nous avons suffisamment débattu en faisant les diagnostics des problèmes qui sont à la base des inégalités. Qu'il s'agisse des politiques monétaires, qu'il s'agisse des politiques budgétaires ou qu'il s'agisse des politiques de fiscalité. Maintenant, il est question de voir concrètement comment ces différentes politiques ont une incidence sur le niveau de vie des populations qui sont derrière la montagne qu'on ne voit pas. Ça, c'est les populations déshéritées. En Afrique, nous avons près de 70% de nos populations qui vivent dans le milieu rural. Donc, dans le milieu rural. Il s'agit de voir concrètement qu'est-ce que nous allons faire pour venir en appui, en aide à ces 70% pour relever leur niveau. Ça, c'est un. Deuxièmement, il s'agit de voir comment on peut bloquer l'exode rural qui constitue à la déperdition de la main-d'œuvre du secteur rural vers les villes et les régions les plus nantis. Pour cela, il faut intéresser et attacher les jeunes dans les campagnes. Il faut attacher et développer les secteurs pouvant générer des revenus, et pour les femmes et pour les jeunes du milieu rural. Ça, ce n'est pas chose facile. Par rapport à la monétarisation, il est question de voir ici concrètement quelles sont les mesures à prendre pour inciter aux revenus les femmes, les jeunes, c'est-à-dire créer des banques qui investiront dans l'occupation à travers des projets modestes des femmes, des jeunes, pour les amener à se prendre en charge, et tout cela concourra bien entendu à réduire les inégalités à tous les niveaux. Je vous remercie.
There was a hand. Yep.
Yes, I am Sakendema from Sierra Leone. Yesterday I was in a political inequality session, and discussions in the sessions where inequality could be addressed from within and could be addressed with a political will. And challenges, inequalities occurs as a result of customs and traditions and the marginalization of some set of people, especially women, in terms of decision and involvement in politics.
Excellencies, I'm sorry.
Herbert McLeod from Sierra Leone. One very interesting takeaway for me was the importance of functional inequality and its ramifications and implications for structural transformation. I think we shouldn't leave this out.
Excellencies, in the rich discussion yesterday, it is clear that oftentimes economic inequalities morph into political inequalities and vice versa. And that in thinking about inequalities, they don't sit neatly within one category without the possibility of migration. So certain social inequalities do become political and economic and vice versa. And the second thing is that you do need two things. You do need institutions, structures, you do need policies, but you also need this paradigm shift that we're talking about in terms of the political culture, in terms of how we do things. Because ultimately, economic policies are choices that are made by those with the power to choose. And the conversation clearly pointed out that there are constraints, some visible, some non-visible. And those constraints may be global, or the constraints may be within the structure and the culture of the local polity. These were rich conversations. And I trust that with the brief recap that you heard, and also the fact that the point was repeatedly made that they are multidimensional in nature, inequalities, that in this morning we then have the onerous task of resolving the question, now that we know and are agreed that this is the character and nature of inequalities, what should or must we do, and how? The tools that we should put in place to deal with them. I hand back to the chair, to the Honorable Minister, and thank you for the accommodation and the time to recap.
Thank you very much. We would all agree that yeah, thank you very much. I think we are here for very rich dialogue. As I can see, the debate over, spanning back to the structural adjustment days, definitely questions of global inequality even in the advanced countries, as you can see, have been worsened in recent times by the global financial crisis that has seen most advanced economies come to their knees, and the impact that it has had on, resources, their own doses of adjustments. Within this period, we've seen a lot of countries we've seen some countries, including African countries, classified as emerging, or in more recent times, the means, which seems to suggest some progress, and whether that also reduces global inequality, and by definition, what goes on the continent is also a question of debate. As a recent book that has just been published seems to, and it's making a lot of debate around globally, seems to suggest. I think one of the contributions was with respect to the way forward and what do we do. And I think, therefore, it is opportune at this, time, to move on to the next session, which is identifying policy actions to move forward the global Africa equitable development agenda. I would think that holds some of the elements, or would address some of the elements of Dr. Nimue Thompson's, questions in particular about, what do we do concretely, in moving the agenda, forward. So I would cede the chair at this stage to Madam Rita Matovu, who, in a short bio, we know as a lawyer by profession, I believe from Uganda, and chairperson of the Equal Opportunities Commission, in Uganda. So, Madam, over to you at this stage, to take over the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Good morning, distinguished panelists, and good morning, distinguished participants. We are seeing the back end of the MDGs, which were put in place for the benefit of all globally, so that the percentage we had for the USA, for Europe, and other places were the same as for the developing Africa. This presupposed that circumstances and conditions were at par. But as we approach the end of the MDGs and face post-2015 era, we have to identify policy actions to move forward the global and Africa equitable development agenda, politically, socially, and economically. This panel of distinguished experts is here to enlighten us on the possibilities, modalities, and hopefully not impossibilities. We have about an hour and a quarter, and I think we're going to request the panelists to each have 15 minutes so that we can have 15 minutes left over for discussion. Honorable Minister, we are starting with Senator Bill Keru, representing Mandera County in Kenya.
Assalamu alaikum. I don't know whether you can all see the slides or whether there's need to reduce this particular light on this side here. Very well. I will be very brief. I have only 15 minutes. And I want to take probably 5 minutes just to recap some of the key issues around inequalities that we've been discussing the last couple of days to form a sort of a, if you will, a backdrop for the policy actions that I will propose. We may quite agree or not, but I think in summary, some of the issues that we have raised has been the factors that are largely responsible for the inequalities in Africa can be summarized very briefly. And I mentioned that the most important, in my view, and really which seems to come out, although not quite openly, is the failure of the political leadership in Africa. I think at the end of the day, the most important thing that has affected development in Africa has been the quality of governance. And I think we don't need to elaborate that. And that feeds into the policy and is responsible for the challenges that we have had, in spite of the fact that this continent still remains resource-wise the richest continent. We have the highest levels of poverty and inequality in the country. So the socio-economic policy decisions that we have had have invariably been influenced by the political decisions, globalization included. I think the other thing is the inequitable development has been by choice. It has come out clearly. It's by choice because it's policy. It's policy. And once a country has the chance to make a decision and to make an appropriate decision, and that decision is responsible, then for those inappropriate policies and actions, we have to say it is by choice. The liberalization and deregulation partly also created an equal playing field and an equal access, and I think that has also come out. The liberalization has been followed, was followed up in this country, in Africa largely, by what I call predatory private sector. Private sector that was largely driven by profit motive and that focused immediately after liberalization on privatization. And other things that I've mentioned there, opposition to minimum wages, demand for tax incentives. All of our continents, you'll find countries have set up export processing zones and all kinds of incentives to try and attract investors. Poor terms, and I've given here an example of the flower farms in Kenya, one of the richest in terms of exports, but in terms of performance, when you look at the way the employees are the poorest employees you can imagine because of the working environment and so forth. Again, the growth of the economy in these countries, in our countries, have largely been what I call elitist economy, with very little trickle-down effect. And so consequently, we have poor quality growth. Growth that does not create jobs, growth that does not reduce poverty, and we've seen all that, I think, in the discussion. And I think in recent, studies done by IMF, you've seen the question, you've seen the example of Mozambique. When you compare the growth in Mozambique for the last 20 years, one of the most spectacular growths, and when you compare that with another country in Asia, Vietnam, but when you look at the quality of growth, the way it has reduced, the amount of, the significance is the reduction in poverty in that country compared to Vietnam, then you realize that really the quality of growth, and this is why I've said it's elitist, in the sense that our economy is always focuses on those sectors that actually benefit those of us who are probably in the cities, or those of us who are in positions in government. This is the economy about the tourism, economy about tea, coffee, the economy about those areas that really does not, at the end of the day, because when you know that in Africa, 80% of the people are dependent on agriculture, subsistence agriculture. 80% of the employment is in the informal sector, really. And those sectors of the economy are hardly captured in what we see as the economy in Africa, really. When the finance minister talks about the economy, he does not talk about the economy of the 80% informal sector. Those figures do not talk about the 80% that are dependent on agriculture and so forth in the rural areas. Again, we have also been told that the structural changes in the economy, the move, for example, we heard from Juma here in Tanzania, an example. The move from agriculture to industry did not automatically result in any significant gains. In fact, it ended up in significant losses to employment and so forth. So really, again, in terms of the structural changes that we have seen, those policies have not been very fruitful. The multilateral institutions, such as the World Bank and IMF, and the impact on policy decisions have also largely been responsible for the inequalities that we have seen. And I'll give you a good example. In the early years, about a decade or so ago, where it has been very difficult because of those decisions to even recruit teachers. And when you don't have teachers in public primary schools, who gets affected? It's the children of the poor. When you don't get nurses in hospitals, and because of those conditions that have been set, you cannot recruit because of the control of this policy or that policy on wage or this or that, then you find that the poor really, and that resulted in significant expansion of inequalities. So in short, and we talked about this yesterday even in the breakout sessions, the macroeconomic issues really do not focus on those areas that would have significant impact on the lives of the ordinary. So when we talk about the macroeconomic issues, our finance ministers largely would talk about what? They talk about the inflation rate, the interest rate, the exchange rates, and all those things that really, at the end of the day, do not significantly affect that rural economy that the majority of our people focus. So the result is, again, adverse social impacts. We also had talked about the imperial, in quotes, financial sector that we have in our countries that focuses largely on what I call money trade. So you find in all our countries, the finance sector is the most profitable, the best performing, whatever the economic situation in the country. And you find the reason is because they target those areas in terms of financing, in terms of lending, they target the areas where they get the maximum yield. As opposed to, and I think this has been discussed here yesterday, investing or financing productive enterprise. And the result is that a very significant part of the economy, for example, the SMEs, the farmers, who are the key people who would have transformed, really, are the ones that do not have access to finance. If they have access, the cost of finance would be prohibitive for them to. And so governments really have generally ignored that. So lastly, I want to also mention the reference to the unfair trade practices, again, from institutions such as WTO and so forth. And this has been very pronounced, particularly with regards to agriculture. And the many years that the discussions around agriculture have been going on in WTO, I think we all know that the impact those reforms would have on the economies of many of the countries in this region. So in brief, Madam Chair, I just wanted to recap some of the key issues that had been highlighted, and then look at the options, the policy options. And I want to start off by suggesting that we need appropriate legal and policy framework on inequalities at national and international levels in all future initiatives. And let's start off with the post-2015 development agenda, Africa Union 2063. Let us have, in all of those goals, we must include clearly a framework on inequalities that must underpin all the goals that will be, in all the dimensions that we have mentioned. Second, I want to suggest also that a universal charter to sort of outlaw, and I said in quotes, regulations and policies with outright inequity, and encourage equitable socio-economic development programs and initiatives. We have charters on human rights. We have charters that are being enforced, globally by all the countries that are members of the UN. I want to suggest, let us have a framework to reject discrimination and enforce equal access to development, equal access to resources, equal access to jobs. Let us try and see why we cannot. My suggestion is I think we can, and I think it's time we mainstream this kind of a charter. I also want to suggest that in terms of the constitutions or the legal framework in African countries, we can develop a framework, a legal framework in the constitution or through other laws for equitable development that underscores three things. One, decentralization and public participation. And we've also heard in the last few days that, and I think the Ghanaian president, when he opened the meeting, did highlight this, how significantly decentralization of the public service has impacted on development in his country. And we all also appreciate, and I want to give an example here of Kenya in the last constitution that we have had in 2010, that decentralized the governance structure from the center to the counties, at the same time also decentralized allocation of resources down to the counties. And the impact really is significant. Counties or regions of the country that had no access to resources before have an opportunity now to have their own governors, their own legislative assembly, and have the decision. They make their own decision on what they want to do in terms of their growth, in terms of their investment, in terms of their development. And I think that is quite significant because then it gives those regions an opportunity to really opportunity to feel that they belong and they have access. So I think it's very important, and I think in countries where the governance system does include decentralization and public participation, and I really think one can borrow from that constitution in Kenya, that every legal process or policy decision that the government makes must involve public participation. It's a legal requirement that you cannot create a law, whether it's at the county level or the national level, without the input of the people. And I think it becomes very important, therefore, to, it gives people opportunities to then focus on equitable. The second thing is on equitable resource allocation. Again, a criteria that can be developed, and this again is, and I want to borrow again from our constitution in Kenya, that provides specific criteria for resource allocation, so that all the counties know from the annual budget expenditure of the government how much you're actually going to get based on the criteria that has been provided for in law. And this is a criteria that is developed by the people through their representatives in Parliament and in the Senate. And at the same time, all appointments to senior public offices are also done on a basis that takes into account regional and ethnic representation. Again, that has a significance in terms of addressing some of the inequalities that we have seen in the past. So that today, if you want to make an appointment in Kenya, you have to really check any government institution or public institution that wants to make appointment of, including the president, if he has to make the cabinet appointment, or at the county level. All the appointments must take into account both regional and ethnic. That again is significant because it addresses some of the problems that we have seen. Political inclusion through fair representation of all groups. Again, that we have seen, it's something that works. When you enforce it through the constitution, you can address the inclusion of gender, persons with disabilities and marginalized groups. Then there is need for us to review. Another option, policy option that I want to look at is to review the economic growth paradigms that we have in the country in terms of being able to assess and measure growth for a number of factors. For example, in terms of the redistributive effect of income, in terms of its inclusiveness, job creation, poverty reduction. And I think this requires that we review the fiscal policies, the development blueprints. Many of the countries talk of development, like Kenya, you talk of Vision 2030, maybe Ghana, you talk of Vision 2020? And then we talk of flashing projects. Are those projects really, when they're implemented, huge projects that governments come up with based on those blueprints? You need to interrogate them. You need to with regards to whether they lead to job creation, whether they will, reduce poverty, whether they, inclusiveness. You need to look at all this so that we question also the traditional sectors for funding, government expenditure. When you look at the traditional sectors of the economy, and vis-a-vis those that really would impact on the lives of the poor, and and would at the same time also focus on areas that largely contribute to inequality. The SMEs, for example, and fighters. I'm left with Dan. Okay, let me summarize. The last point I want to mention, which is important, is collateralization of assets such as land, livestock, and so forth in Africa. One of the things that you will appreciate is that the reason why we are largely poor is because our assets are not really collateral at all for the purpose of accessing finance. We all have got land, we have property in Africa, but because our lands are not properly registered, they do not have titles, they do not form security, they are not acceptable in banks, then we have people remaining poor in many parts of Africa really because of that. And I think it's important that and if you compare with developed countries, this is one of the most important things that contributes to their wealth. It's the fact that they're able to use their assets. Whatever, if you have a chair, if you have a table, forget about land. You use it as a collateral to access credit, to access finance. But we have land, valuable more than any other, with resource. But because of our systems, we are not able to utilize them, and we remain poor. And I think that's some of the things that we need to address. And lastly, because I think of time, government must develop specific interventions in law to remedy historical inequalities. Historical. And I've given examples, for example, in Kenya, with safety net programs for vulnerables, equalization fund that addresses those areas that have been left behind for many years, constituency development funds, ways of funds, women enterprise fund, youth development, so many specific interventions that address inequalities that have been there in the past. I think that is important. The central banks, again, because of what I mentioned earlier about the financial institutions, they need to develop regulatory framework for financial institutions on lending to productive employment sector. There is no such a thing as the market. Let me tell you, and you have seen it after post-2008 financial crisis. The state must be involved. And we have seen when you completely deregulate what has happened. And I think the trend nowadays, even in developed countries, is to regulate. And I think our banks must be able to give direction in terms of the financial institutions. Taxation measures, I think, need to be equitable. I don't need to overemphasize. And last but not least, political leadership must be accountable. And I think that, more than anything else, determines whether we will end the challenges we have in terms of corruption, in terms of conflicts, ethnicity, and so forth, which contribute largely to the problems we have had in our continent. Sorry, I've run out of time, but we'll respond to one question. Thank you very much.
I see why you needed more time, because this is very important and it is relevant to all of us. But now allow me to call upon Professor Tekiwa Menu, who is the Director, Social Development Policy Division of the United Nations Commission for Africa, Economic Commission for Africa. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good morning, everybody. Honorable Minister of Finance of Ghana, Madam Chairperson Nananom, fellow panelists, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to participate in this panel on identifying the policy actions to move forward the global Africa Equitable Development Agenda, and to present the ECA perspective on this issue. Distinguished participants, we know, and especially the sessions that we've had over the past 3 days, has brought out the many different perspectives, and also the fact that throughout history there's never been only one path to sustain development. And In my opinion, this gives us great hope because we know that African countries differ widely in their resource endowments, human capital accumulation, population densities and structures and political systems. So in other words, there is not a one-size-fits-all. And these differences suggest that the road to sustained growth and development will differ across countries, with each country facing different obstacles, challenges, and opportunities. Yesterday in our session in the afternoon on social policies and equitable social policies and social services, one of our participants asked the question that we're talking about transformation, but what exactly are we transforming towards? Where do we want to be? What kind of society do we want, and who is part of this discussion? Therefore, we need to resolve these issues in order to really determine where exactly we want to be. And that is why we cannot think of a one-size-fits-all solution. Again, over the past few days, when we have been talking about inequality in Africa, the consensus has been that in many African countries, the ladder of opportunities is becoming much harder to climb. The presentation in one of the sessions on the multiple dimensions of poverty index show that there are large disparities in access to health and education services, land and other productive assets between the poorest and the richest within and across countries. And we also know that wealth inequalities are transmitted across generations and are present across locations, trapping large segments of society in poverty and exclusion. And data has been presented about some of our countries, Angola, Botswana, Comoros, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, and Swaziland, for example, which count among the continent's top 10 most unequal countries. We also know that there has been slow progress in addressing poverty and inequality, and that the very nature of economic growth on the continent is creating a vicious circle whereby inequality and slowdown in economic growth are mutually reinforcing. Now, the Rio 2012 summit reaffirmed the need for a world that is just, equitable, and inclusive, and the need for all of us to work together to promote sustained and inclusive economic growth, social development, and environmental protection to benefit all. And in this regard, we know that we should realize the internationally agreed development goals, including the MDGs, by promoting decent and productive employment and social protection in both formal and informal economies. I know that Commissioner Maropeng will say more about the African Union 2063 vision, but I just want to stress that at the continental level, the African Union 2063 vision provides an ambitious and timely context, as well as the basis for tackling the equality development agenda in Africa. And the Common Africa position on the post-2015 development agenda places a high premium on equitable development, which is to be anchored, among other things, on the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment. Again, the Joint Economic Commission for Africa, Africa Union Commission, the Africa Development Bank, and UNDP outcome document of the regional consultations on the post-2015 development agenda has reaffirmed the need to prioritize equity and social inclusion, as well as to pay attention to women, children, the youth, the elderly, and people living with disabilities and the displaced in the development agenda. And this position was strongly reiterated by the ICPD Beyond 2014 Review Summit, which was held in 2013 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which called for economic development with a special focus on the youth and women. In terms of the position of the ECA and to some extent the UN in general, the ECA recognizes that there cannot be meaningful development in Africa without addressing the fundamental causes of inequality, such as economic and social power structures in the decision-making process. And for this reason, we are supporting the African Union Commission and the regional economic communities in their efforts to promote equality and equity in the decision-making processes through a number of legal instruments and protocols. However, these instruments need to be translated into national policies. And ECA's objective going forward is to work closely with member states to achieve Africa's transformation agenda by supporting member states in their efforts to implement growth-oriented macroeconomic policies and to restore development planning with a view to reducing inequality. As a Commission, we have also devoted our energies to promoting a people-driven social and economic transformation agenda anchored on well-grounded research to influence policy-making processes in Africa. As we have heard throughout this conference, he or she who has the numbers controls the narrative. And in this regard, we are investing heavily in the production and collection of credible data and statistics to inform our policy interventions. The ECA also believes that for economic transformation to be meaningful in Africa, member states should accelerate the path of growth, diversify the sources of growth, invest in physically sustainable social protection programs, reduce inequality, and promote decent jobs and rural development. And we reiterate the position of the report of the high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 development agenda, that the new development agenda should be driven by 5 big transformative shifts. That is, 1, leave no one behind; 2, put sustainable development at the core; 3, transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth; 4, build peace and effective, open and accountable institutions for all; and forge a new global partnership based on solidarity, cooperation, and mutual accountability. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, throughout this conference, we have also heard about the importance of appropriate policies and the need for continuities in policy. And in terms of policy actions to move forward the Africa Equitable Development Agenda, I want to propose, these are the positions of the ECA, that we must ensure domestic resource funding for the provision of basic social services, including access to housing, water, sanitation, and energy. 2, increasing investment in education and skills development, and ensuring that macroeconomic policies support employment creation. 3, extending the coverage of social protection and decent work standards to informal workers. 4, progressive income taxation and highly redistributive social transfers targeting education and health spending, as well as child and old age benefits. And lastly, moving beyond goals and targets to incorporating recommendations on the policy instruments that are required to ensure more equitable opportunities and outcomes. Since our finance minister is here and he's in charge of implementing many of these, I look forward to him engaging with us when it comes to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that insightful presentation to us. Now allow me to call upon Mr. Neil Pierre. I hope I can pronounce that properly. He's the Chief Policy Coordination Branch, Department for Economic and Social Affairs, the United Nations. Welcome, sir.
You did a very good job with the name, by the way. And don't associate me with anything French, because my French is very limited. I'm from Guyana, but with a French first name, that's my last name. while we're waiting for the presentation to be uploaded, much of which I will go through very quickly because I wanted to capture a lot of the threads of what's in my presentation have been featured in various ways throughout the discussion. But I especially want to highlight the intervention earlier this morning by our colleague from the government of Ghana, where he focused on some of the external drivers of inequality. Those in fact will feature significantly in what I'm about to say. So I'll shift the focus a little bit in my presentation, starting from where Professor just ended, to talk a little bit about what's taking place from the New York end of the UN spectrum, but specifically from the intergovernmental side of things. Yes? Okay, the background of my presentation, the structure of the presentation is basically, I'll talk a little quickly about the Economic and Social Council, which I work with very directly, as well as the UN General Assembly. I will address the issue of inequality at the global level. We'll talk a little bit about the sustaining development gains, what are some of the drivers of inequality, and I'll end with some way forward suggestions. Now, for those of you who are not aware of it, the Economic and Social Council is one of the charter bodies of the United Nations. The others are, of course, the General Assembly, the Security Council. We are a little less known well-known of those charter bodies. Charter bodies because they were written into the charter from the foundation of the United Nations. The context of much of what we're talking about, of course, goes back to the Millennium Declaration of 2000 and the MDGs. But important milestones in the process of measuring development progress globally, one of them has been the Millennium Summit, which happened in 2005. And since then, there was one every 5 years in 2010, and there's going to be one again in 2015. But two main outcomes of that summit of 2005, with respect to focusing on tracking the progress in development under the MDGs and the internationally agreed development goals, were a mandate that ECOSOC should conduct annual ministerial reviews of development progress globally. And secondly, there should be a development cooperation forum held in the context of ECOSOC every 2 years. In essence, the AMR, as we've come to know it, really was meant to address MDGs goals 1 to 7. And the DCF really is the forum at which goal 8 is to be addressed in terms of the partnership for development and development cooperation. Since then, we've had a few additional milestones. One of them was, of course, reference was made just a while ago to the Rio Plus 20 conference in June. There are some significant outcomes of that process, one of which was that development really is not about social or economic, it's about all dimensions of development. And really the need to integrate economic, social, and environmental dimensions with cross-cutting issues of governance and rule of law, equality, human rights, and all of those. Another main outcome was the mandate to set up a high-level political forum on sustainable development. And yet another is to link national, regional, and global levels of development. Now, the backdrop of all of the processes and substantive discussions that are taking place is really the preparation of a post-2015 framework which will replace the MDGs as of next year. That's the overall context. Now, let me very quickly zero in on what the AMR is doing this year, which is the context for my presence here also. Each year we select a theme as the overarching focus of the review of progress. And this year the theme is quite a mouthful, as you can see, addressing ongoing and emerging challenges for meeting the Millennium Development Goals and for sustaining development in the future. In a nutshell, we've broken that down into three main priority areas of focus. The first is really to look at what are the institutional, policy, and other enablers of development. In other words, what have been some of the drivers at the institutional and governmental level that may have impeded development or enhanced the progress of the MDGs. The second focus is What is the role of inclusion, equity, and participation? And the theme of this conference fits very squarely into both of those, but more particularly the second one. And the third focus is we're saying, how well are we able to measure development progress using the purpose of the AMR as I outlined it earlier on. Now, let me segue quickly into the issues of global inequality. Now, in the preparations for the AMR theme, given those three areas of priority focus as I just outlined, we have done a lot of research, and we're about to release, the Secretary General is about to release a report that will be the backdrop of the discussions for the AMR this year. The report will state some of the obvious things, growing inequality within countries, and we've heard much of that in respect of the African continent, but it's a global phenomenon. The report will also highlight that progress has been made in reducing poverty in almost all countries. There are specific cases where there have been setbacks rather than progress. And the report will highlight, we're in the process of highlighting, that inequality between countries is severe, it's substantive, and it's because of both structural or historical and policy issues. Now, some of those policy issues, and we come back to the intervention earlier this morning, multilateral rules themselves are the basis for much of the global inequality that exists. Globalization has actually fostered a lot of the inequalities between and among countries. The question of what is the role of markets versus the role of government, it's a very significant part of the discussion, and it's a causal factor of much of the inequality. The role of government, linked to the structural adjustment, the history of structural adjustment programs, in many countries, but particularly in Africa, has been diminished, if not demolished in many cases. And so the effect of that, we were told then that the markets should prevail and markets will fix things. Inadequate attention to fairness and rights-based approach in the international discourse that has taken place over the last decades. Now, how do we then sustain development gains where those have happened under the MDGs and the internationally agreed development framework? We're advocating that there's a need to build strong institutions. We have to get back to the basics. Strong institutions are where the implementation of development programs and the achievement of development objectives will begin. We're also saying that we need to institutionalize successful practices. We need to identify what those successes are and know what caused them, what are their main features, and then institutionalize them so that they're not just a flash-in-the-pan experience, but something that's sustained despite who's in government or what are the larger issues a society has to tackle with. We are also saying that the need to tackle domestic drivers of inequality. There's need for a greater sharing of the cake. I need not elaborate on that. There's also need to tackle the constraints of growth and sustainable development.